"Old man, what do you think you're doing here?" The voice was sharp, laced with the kind of unearned authority that grated on the nerves. It cut through the low hum of conversation in the crowded mess hall at Fort Benning. Every head turned. The target of the question, an elderly man sitting alone at a small table, slowly looked up from his cup of black coffee. He wore a simple, well-worn field jacket over a crisp but dated uniform. His face was a road map of wrinkles, his back stooped with age, but his eyes held a clarity that was unsettling. He didn't answer immediately, just held the gaze of the young officer standing over him, a captain by the bars on his collar. The captain's name tag read Hayes. He was tall, athletic, with a haircut so precise it looked like it was drawn on with a ruler. He radiated impatience. "I asked you a question," Captain Hayes pressed, his voice louder this time, drawing more attention. "This is an active duty mess hall. Unless you have a valid military ID and a reason to be here, you're trespassing." The old man took a slow sip of his coffee. He set the mug down with a quiet, deliberate click. "I'm just having a coffee, son," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to carry surprising weight. "It's Captain," Hayes snapped, his jaw tightening. "And you will address me as such. Now, your identification." "Let's see it." He held out a hand, palm up, expectant. The old man reached into his jacket, his movements unhurried. He produced a worn leather wallet and extracted an identification card. It was an older format, the lamination slightly yellowed at the edges, but it was clearly official. It identified him as Sergeant Major Elias Thorne, retired. Hayes snatched the card and examined it with a sneer. "Sergeant Major, huh? Retired a long time ago, it looks like. Doesn't give you the right to just wander onto base and use the facilities whenever you feel like it. There are protocols around them." The room had fallen quiet. Young privates watched with wide eyes. A few seasoned sergeants shifted uncomfortably, their expressions a mixture of annoyance at the captain's arrogance and curiosity about the old man who refused to be rattled. Thorne simply watched him, his calm a stark contrast to Hayes's coiled aggression. "I was invited," Thorne said softly. "Guest of the command." Hayes let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Guest of the command? Don't be ridiculous. General Vance doesn't have time for relics. I'm head of base security for this event, and your name isn't on any list I've seen. I think you're lying." The accusation hung in the air, thick and ugly. Thorne's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened, a flicker of ancient steel behind the placid blue. He said nothing. This silence seemed to infuriate Hayes more than any argument could. He saw it as defiance, as the insolence of an old man who didn't understand the new order. "You know what I think?" Hayes continued, leaning in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, humiliating whisper meant for the whole room to hear. "I think you're one of those fakes. A guy who bought a uniform at a surplus store and likes to walk around pretending he's a hero. We get them from time to time. Stolen valor. It's pathetic." The insult was a physical thing, a blow aimed at the core of the old man's identity. A few of the older non-commissioned officers in the room winced. They knew the type of man Hayes was. All regulations and no respect, a product of peacetime ambition rather than wartime grit. They also recognized the quiet dignity in the old sergeant major, a bearing that couldn't be faked. It was forged in crucibles the young captain couldn't even imagine. Thorne slowly pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. He was shorter than Hayes, his body frail with the years, yet his presence seemed to fill the space around him. He met the captain's glare without flinching. "I am no fake, Captain." The words were quiet, but they held the certainty of a mountain. "Oh, really?" Hayes mocked, taking a step back and looking Thorne up and down with exaggerated scrutiny. "Then prove it. Tell me your last unit. Your MOS. Let's see how much you really know." 75th Ranger Regiment. Thorne answered calmly. 11Z. Infantry Senior Sergeant. The answer was immediate, correct. A ripple of murmuring went through the NCOs in the room. 11 Zulu was a designation for the most senior infantryman, a role of immense responsibility. Hayes paused, momentarily thrown off. The answer was too quick, too specific for a fraud. But his pride was already committed. He couldn't back down now. "Anyone can memorize a designation," he scoffed, recovering his swagger. "That proves nothing. You special operations types, you all have call signs, right? A handle you use in the field. If you're who you say you are, if you're this legendary ranger, You must have had one. So tell me, old man, right here, right now, what was your call sign? The challenge was a final, desperate gambit. It was a deeply personal question, a piece of a soldier's soul not meant to be thrown around a mess hall as a party trick. It was the ultimate disrespect. The room held its breath. The young soldiers looked to the captain, their champion of order. The older soldiers looked at the sergeant major, their faces etched with concern. They saw a quiet old veteran being publicly stripped of his dignity by an arrogant officer who valued protocol over people. Thorne stood silent for a long moment. His eyes seemed to look past Hayes, past the walls of the mess hall, into a distant, shadowed past. He had not spoken that name in over 40 years. It belonged to a younger man, a man who lived in a world of fire and whispers, a man he had buried long ago. To speak it now felt like breaking a sacred vow. But the captain's smug, challenging face was waiting. The eyes of the young soldiers were on him. And in that moment, Thorne understood. This wasn't about him. It was about them. It was about a lesson that needed to be taught. He drew a slow, steadying breath. His gaze returned to Captain Hayes, and the ancient steel was back, sharp and cold. You want to know my call sign? He asked, his voice barely a whisper, yet it echoed in the profound silence. Hayes smirked, sensing victory. Yeah, I do. Let's hear it. Or can't you remember that far back? Thorne's eyes locked onto the captain's. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken history. The clatter of a fork dropping onto a plate sounded like a gunshot. A master sergeant near the back of the room, a man with a chest full of ribbons and a face like worn leather, slowly rose to his feet, his eyes wide with a dawning, impossible realization. He had heard whispers, old legends told in hushed tones by grizzled instructors at Sears School. Stories of a ghost unit from a forgotten war. He started moving forward, as if drawn by an invisible force. The old man's voice, when it came, was not loud, but it possessed a resonance that shook the very foundations of the room. He spoke two simple words. Phoenix 1, for a heartbeat. There was nothing. The name meant nothing to Captain Hayes, who let out a dismissive snort. It meant nothing to the young privates, who looked around in confusion. But to the master sergeant, it was like a lightning strike. He stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth agape. An old worn officer sitting near the kitchen, a pilot who had flown in 3 different conflicts, choked on his water, his eyes bulging. He scrambled to his feet, knocking his chair over with a loud clatter. The name spread through the older ranks like a shockwave. Phoenix. It was a name from the classified annals of military history, a legend whispered but never confirmed. Operation Phoenix was a myth, a ghost story about a small team sent on a suicide mission deep behind enemy lines during the height of the Cold War. A mission that officially never happened. A mission where every member was declared killed in action. They were sent to prevent a catastrophe, to stop a conflict from escalating into a world-ending war. The leader of that team, the one who held it all together against impossible odds, was known only by his call sign. The man who walked into hell and held the line. Phoenix 1. What did you just say? Hayes demanded, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. He saw the looks on the faces of the senior NCOs. He saw the raw shock, the dawning, terrified respect. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew the ground had just shifted beneath his feet. At that moment, the doors to the mess hall swung open. General Vance, a formidable 3-star general with a chest full of medals that told the story of the nation's most recent conflicts, strode in, flanked by 2 aides. He was there to give a speech to the troops. He stopped short, taking in the scene. The entire room silent and on its feet, Captain Hayes pale and confused, and the old man standing in the center of it all, straight and proud. The general's eyes fell on Elias Thorne. His professional mask dissolved, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. He bypassed Captain Hayes as if he were a piece of furniture. He walked directly to the old Sergeant Major and stopped 3 feet in front of him. For a moment, the 3-star general looked like a young lieutenant again, standing before a living monument. Sergeant Major Thorne, General Vance said, his voice thick with emotion. I can't believe it's really you. We all thought you were gone. Thorne gave a small, sad smile. Reports were exaggerated, sir. General Vance let out a shaky breath, a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. He turned to the stunned room, his eyes blazing. He looked at Captain Hayes, and his expression turned to ice. "Captain," he began, his voice dangerously quiet. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Hayes swallowed hard, his face ashen. "Sir, he was unauthorized. I was just following protocol, the general repeated, the word dripping with contempt. "You were just humiliating a man to whom every single person in this uniform owes a debt they can never repay. You stand there in your starched uniform, puffed up with your own importance, and you have no idea you're in the presence of living history." He turned his attention back to the room at large. "Most of you will have never heard of Operation Phoenix. It's not in your history books. It's buried under 50 years of classification. It was a mission so dangerous, so critical, that the men who went on it were declared dead before they even left. They were ghosts. They went into a place from which no one was expected to return, to stop a war that would have killed millions." He pointed a trembling finger at Elias Thorne. This man, Sergeant Major Elias Thorne, was Phoenix 1. He was the commander of that unit. He and his team held off an entire enemy division for 3 days with almost no support. They completed their mission, saved countless lives, and paid a terrible price. He was the only one who made it out, and he spent 2 years in an enemy prison before he escaped and walked across a continent to freedom. When he finally came home, the mission was already buried. For national security, his survival had to remain a secret. He was given a new name, a quiet life, and asked to fade away. He did it without complaint. "Because he is a soldier," the general's voice cracked with emotion. He turned back to Thorne, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "My father was a young intelligence officer on that mission's planning staff. He spent the rest of his life believing he had sent you and your men to your deaths. It haunted him until the day he died. He called you the bravest man he ever knew." The story settled over the room, a heavy blanket of awe and shame. The young soldiers looked at the frail old man as if seeing him for the first time, not as a relic, but as a giant. Captain Hayes looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. His arrogance had been stripped away, leaving behind the raw, sickening realization of his monumental error. He hadn't just disrespected a veteran. He had desecrated a sacred legend. General Vance took a deep breath, composing himself. He straightened his uniform, his movements precise and filled with purpose. He then did something no one in the room had ever seen a 3-star general do for an enlisted man, retired or not. He snapped to attention, his back ramrod straight. His arm shot up in the sharpest, most respectful salute he had ever rendered. "Phoenix 1. The general's voice boomed, clear and strong. "It is the greatest honor of my career to stand in your presence. Welcome home, Sergeant Major." For a second, there was only the sight of the general saluting the old man. Then, the warrant officer who had knocked over his chair saluted. The master sergeant who had first recognized the name saluted, his hand trembling slightly. A chain reaction ignited. Across the room, one by one, then in dozens, every soldier, from the lowest private to the highest-ranking officer, rose and rendered a salute. The sound was a crisp, unified whisper of hands meeting brows, a silent, thunderous apology, and a wave of profound respect. The air vibrated with it. Captain Hayes was the last. His movements were stiff, jerky, his face a mask of utter shame. He raised his hand, his eyes locked on the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the man he had so casually and cruelly dismissed. Elias Thorne stood tall. The stoop in his shoulders seemed to have vanished. He looked at the sea of salutes, his old, clear eyes glistening. He did not return the salute to the room. Instead, he raised his own hand and returned the general's salute, a gesture between two soldiers who understood the true cost of the uniform. He held it for a long moment, then slowly lowered his arm. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer tense, but reverent. It was the silence of a chapel, a hallowed space where something profound had just occurred. General Vance lowered his own salute and put a hand on Thorne's shoulder. "Come on, Sergeant Major," he said softly. "Let's get you a real cup of coffee." In my office, he guided the old hero toward the door, shielding him from the stairs. As they passed Captain Hayes, the general paused, but he didn't look at him. "Captain Hayes," he said, his voice cold as a tombstone. "You are relieved of your duties for the event. Report to my aide at 0600 tomorrow. We are going to have a very long conversation about the difference between authority and honor." He didn't wait for a reply. He and Thorne walked out, leaving a changed room behind them. The spell broke, and soldiers slowly lowered their arms, a low murmur of disbelief and awe filling the space. Captain Hayes stood alone in the middle of the room, a statue of disgrace. Later that evening, long after the mess hall had emptied, Elias Thorne sat in a quiet corner of the base library, a book open but unread in his lap. He was just an old man again, lost in thought. A young private, one of the ones who had witnessed the confrontation, approached him hesitantly, holding 2 steaming mugs. "Sergeant Major?" the private asked, his voice barely a whisper. Thorne looked up, his expression gentle. I brought you some coffee, sir. The good stuff from the canteen, not that mess hall stuff." He held out one of the mugs. Thorne smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. He took the mug. "Thank you, son. What's your name?" "Miller, sir." "Private Miller. Well, Private Miller," Thorne said, patting the chair next to him. "Thank you for the coffee. It means a lot." Miller sat down, perched on the edge of the seat as if he might bolt at any moment. "Sir," he began, struggling for words. What they said you did. I just want to say thank you for your service." Elias Thorne looked at the young man, at the earnest, respectful face, and saw the future. He saw the lesson that had been learned that day, passed from one generation to the next. The arrogance of one officer had been a painful disruption, but the humility and respect of this young private was the healing. The legacy wasn't in the secret missions or the classified files. It was right here, in this moment. "You're welcome, son," Thorne said, his voice soft. "Just do me a favor. Remember that everyone you meet has a story. You just have to be willing to listen." Across the base, in a stark, lonely barracks room, Captain Hayes sat at his desk. He wasn't polishing his boots or ironing his uniform. In front of him was a newly requisitioned, heavily redacted file. The cover page read, "Operation Phoenix. Eyes only." He opened it and began to read, his education finally beginning. The silent salute in the mess hall was over, but its echo would resonate for years, a powerful reminder that heroes don't always wear their greatness on their sleeves, and true strength is often found in the quietest, most unassuming souls.